We're going to be exploring one of the earliest and most pervasive biblical images of God to appear in the scriptures. God as the faithful farmer who refuses to give up on his people. Biblical Images of God, Part 2. Let's dive in. I would imagine that many of you are similar to me. I grew up in the world of church. My parents went to this Southern Baptist church, and I grew up with this image of God as really, really angry. In fact, I remember when I was 11 years old, I attended this revival service with my parents for 3 nights in a row. And even though I was a Christian, I proceeded to give my life to Jesus 3 consecutive nights in a row out of sheer terror because the preaching was just hellfire. And so I spent a good portion of my childhood and my young adult years walking around on eggshells, just believing that God was angry, that he was not happy with me, and that he was going to be dropping these thunderbolts on me if I did anything wrong. And as I've grown up in Jesus, I've begun to see the ways that that image is false and distorted, and this happens to us as we seek to follow Jesus. We pick up these false or distorted images of who God is along the way, and the reason that's so dangerous, like A.W. Tozer says, is that we tend by a secret law of the soul to move toward our mental image of God. And so if you got handed this picture of a God who's angry, well, it's just a matter of time before you're angry. If you got handed this picture of God who's distant and detached, it's just a matter of time before you feel disconnected and like you're not close to anybody. And so one of the things that is just so important for us as we grow in the way of Jesus is to be able to name and identify these false or distorted images of God that we have and turn to the scriptures and turn to Jesus to allow him to give us the true picture of who God really is. And Brad walked us through in the first episode about God as this picture of living water. And today we are going to talk about God as the faithful farmer. And this is one that is really close to my heart because I grew up on my grandfather's farm. My grandfather is 90 years old and he's still farming his own 1,000-acre ranch. And that's why I got the hat. That's my retirement plan. I'm going to follow his footsteps, get myself a tractor and ride off into the sunset. But this is actually one of the first and most repeated images of God that shows up in the Bible. And we read in Genesis chapter 2, verse 8, now the Lord God had planted a garden. So God, right out of the gate, is planting a garden. One verse later, we read that the Lord God made all kinds of trees to grow out of the ground. In verse 10 of chapter 2, a river is watering the garden that flowed from Eden. So God is planting, God is causing to grow, God is watering. These are all things that a farmer does. And then when he's got all of this set in place, he takes the man that he's created, he breathes into him and he gives him life and he says, all right, I'm going to set you down in this garden to work it and to take care of it. And these words are loaded with meaning. They actually show up later in the Hebrew scriptures to describe the work that priests do in the temple or the tabernacle. So to work is the Hebrew word avad, and it can mean to work, but it can also mean to serve or even to carry out the work of worship. So God places this man in the garden to work it, but his work is going to be a kind of service, a loving service. And then there's this phrase, to take care of, that's the Hebrew word shamar, and it literally means to nurture, to guard, to protect, and in some cases even to husband, this tender conservation. And so this is the image that we see of God right out of the gate. And I want to show you Midrash from the Jewish kind of reflections on the Hebrew scriptures. And it's a late midrash. It comes to us from some 500 years after the writing of the New Testament. But it perfectly captures the way the Jewish people thought about this creation story and God as a gardener. So let's read from Ecclesiastes Rabbah. When God created the first human beings, God led them around all the trees of the Garden of Eden and said, "Look at my works. See how beautiful they are, how excellent. For your sake, I created them all. See to it that you do not spoil and destroy my world, my garden, for if you do, there will be no one else to repair it." So God is this gardener who really cares about the garden that he's planted. Now, you can find images, passages, all throughout the Hebrew scriptures about God doing this gardening type work. But I just want to draw your attention to a couple in particular that begin to form this really important theme. So if you look into the book of Exodus chapter 15, the children of Israel have just been rescued from their slavery in Egypt. God parts the waters of the Sea of Reeds. He leads them through on dry ground. And when they get to the other side, they break out in worship. And one of the lines in this song that they sing in Exodus 15 is, "You will bring them," speaking of themselves, us, "in and plant them on the mountain of your inheritance." And in the Psalms, this same imagery is going to get picked up, that you, God, transplanted a vine from Egypt. You drove out the nations and you planted it. So again, God is planting, but now he's planting people, and Israel comes to be associated with God's vine, the vine that God plants in his field. And probably one of the greatest passages, most well-known passages where God is portrayed as a farmer in the Hebrew scriptures comes from the book of Isaiah chapter 5, where we simply read, "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant," and here's this word again, planting, that God is planting people in his land. Now, we live in an industrial society, not an agrarian one. So we have to do some real work to imagine ourselves back into this culture, because most of us have no idea what is involved with planting and just how much effort and toil and labor goes into planting. And so when Isaiah starts to give this poem in Isaiah chapter 5 called the Love Song of the Vineyard, we just read these words, "I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up, he cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a winepress as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit." Now, we hear that passage and we think to ourselves, okay, it sounds like God planted a vineyard. But what an ancient Israelite person would have immediately recognized is that Isaiah is describing the process by which an Israelite farmer would take a bare limestone hillside and then convert it into a fertile vineyard. And so if you come with me on a map to the land of Israel, you can see here, this area is known as the hill country. It's an elevated portion of the country that runs north to southwest of the Dead Sea. And it's actually perfect for growing vines and growing fruit trees. And that's because it has this soil that's made up of limestone. So you get these limestone hills, and when limestone degrades, it leaves behind this beautiful, rich, red terra rosa soil that will stain your clothes. It's almost like Georgia red clay. And this image here is of a hillside that has been converted into a vineyard that's been cultivated with olive trees and vines. But you've got to think back, what did this hillside look like before somebody literally dug into it and made it look like that? And so I just want to walk you through the process. What you would first have to do is start to remove these rocks from this hillside. And as you can see in this picture, I mean, the hill country is just a land of rocks. I mean, this is just it's a never-ending process, removing rocks from the soil. And as you would remove those rocks, you'd stack them into these terraced walls. And as the walls would grow in height, you would then want to bring in soil to backfill those walls so that you would have soil in which to plant your vines. And so once you had that, you would plant a vine. But here's the interesting thing about vines. Vines won't even produce fruit for the first 3 to 5 years. And not only that, but of all of the fruit that you can plant in the hill country, the vine is the most temperamental. It requires the most attention, the most care, the most looking after. So you've already got tons of energy and time invested removing rocks, bringing in soil, and now you plant this vine and you gotta wait 5 years for fruit and you're having to keep an eye on it all the time. It's just a lot of work. And once that vine would start to produce and you're able to harvest grapes, you'd want to protect your investment. So you would relocate your family from the village where you lived out into the field, and you would take some of these extra rocks that you had used for terrace walls and you'd build a watchtower. And you'd literally live in this watchtower during the harvest so that you could keep an eye on everything. And as you harvested those grapes, you would hollow out a spot in a patch of barren limestone on the hillside into a wine press, and then invite your neighbors to take off their sandals and start harvesting these grapes and stepping on these grapes so that you could collect the juice and then allow it to ferment. So all I need you to understand is that this poem in 2 verses that Isaiah gives represents years worth of intense work and labor. The writer Timothy Laniak simply says this, that establishing a vineyard required a family's investment of back-breaking work over several years. And what I need you to understand is that God, as a faithful farmer, is deeply invested in the things that he plants. And think about all the ways that we experience this to be true in our lives. You work on a project on your home. You plant a garden in your backyard. And when you do those things, you feel this deep sense of connection and value. In fact, there's a phrase that's passed into the business world called the Ikea Effect. By a guy named Dan Ariely, a researcher, found that when people go buy furniture at Ikea, the fact that they then have to bring it home and put it together, it increases the value of the furniture in that person's mind, because what's true about God is also true about us, that we value what we create. The more effort and labor we put into something, the greater affection we have for it and the deeper our love. All right, so hold that idea in your mind and come with me into the New Testament, where Jesus is going to pick up this language of God as the faithful farmer. And let's look at how Jesus lives into this language. Whether it's in his parables or his teaching, he's often going to be talking about the kingdom of God is like a farmer who went out to his field, and he's going to talk about soil and seeds. But the passage where Jesus speaks most directly and lives most directly into this image of God as a faithful farmer is John chapter 15, where he's with his disciples and he tells them, I am the true vine and my Father is the gardener. And what I love about this word gardener in Greek, it's the word georgos, is it literally means farmer. My Father is the farmer. But notice what Jesus says next. He says, he cuts off every branch in me. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. Well, that's a little confusing in light of everything that we have just explored about all of the work and love and labor that goes in to establishing a vineyard. Why on earth, if there are branches that are in the vine and they're not producing, why would you cut them off? And we've talked about this passage before at Walking the Text in an episode called Abiding in the Vine, and we'll link to that in the show notes below. But I just want to summarize really briefly what is behind this expression, cuts off. It's a single word in Greek, and the word is airo, and it can mean to lift up, to raise up, or to take away. Now, fascinatingly, this word shows up 101 times in the New Testament, and all of those times it is translated to lift up or to raise up. John 15 is the only place where it is translated as cut off. And what's odd about that is it doesn't make sense even in light of the context of how vine work is done in the land of Israel. So if you look at a vineyard, this is typically what we think of, vines that are lifted off the ground and growing on a trellis, but this is not how vines were grown in the ancient world. Vines were grown along the ground, and they would be allowed to stretch out their branches across the ground. And a lot of times what would happen as they would do this is the moisture could build up on the branch, and it could cause mold to grow that would stunt the growth of the branch, and you'd end up with grapes that look like this, almost like raisins. Now, when a farmer would come along and see, oh, my vineyard that I've invested so much time, effort, and energy in, my branch is not producing great fruit, but it's still attached to the vine. Well, that farmer's not going to get rid of that branch. What these farmers do is they will often prop it up with a rock or a piece of wood, or I've even seen it with like a hunk of car tire. And so I think a much more fitting way to translate this passage is that he lifts up every branch in me that bears no fruit. It fits the context. You're going to see more and more Bible translations footnoting that this is an acceptable translation as well. And also Jesus later in this conversation with his disciples, he's going to talk about branches that don't remain in him and how those branches are removed. And so when you put it all together, you just see this image of God who's deeply invested in a vine, and when that vine is struggling because of his love for it and investment in it, he's going to lift it up and give it time to produce fruit. And keep in mind that when Jesus is having this conversation with his disciples, he's on his way to the cross. And just 4 chapters later, John drops in this little nugget in John 19 that at the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden, a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. And in fact, when Mary Magdalene goes to look for Jesus's body, she doesn't recognize the resurrected Jesus because she thought he was the gardener. Well, of course she does, because that's what we see who God is and what we see Jesus living into. God is deeply invested in what he plants. And if we believe that God is a faithful farmer who loves us and is invested in us and doesn't give up on us, then we, my brothers and sisters, will become like that for those around us. So I just want to finish by inviting you to think of your life as a field, to think of your husband, your wife, your children, your job, your communities, the things that God has entrusted to you. It is this field where the faithful farmer has planted you. And just like his nurturing care for you, he wants you to turn around and offer that nurturing care to work and to keep the places that you have been planted. So my brothers and sisters, may you live out this text well in the field that God has planted you.